It's striking how much conversation there is right now around the ketogenic diet.
Oh, absolutely. It seems to be everywhere.
Yeah, and it's moved way beyond just weight loss, hasn't it?
Yeah.
There's this real buzz about its potential in tackling, well, serious conditions like cancer and type 2 diabetes.
That's right. The interest has definitely broadened.
And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. We've gathered a really interesting set of research, and our goal is pretty straightforward: to understand what the science truly says.
About keto as a possible tool for people facing cancer or type 2 diabetes.
Exactly. We'll be looking at how it might work, the mechanisms,
The evidence, what's actually been shown.
and importantly, the nuances, the gaps, what we still don't know.
Absolutely. It's essential to sift through the hype and focus on the solid research.
So maybe start with the basics. What exactly is the ketogenic diet?
Right. At its core, it fundamentally changes how your body fuels itself. It's very high in fat, very low in carbohydrates, and has adequate or moderate protein. By drastically cutting those carbs, the body starts breaking down fat for energy instead.
And that produces ketones.
Precisely. It produces ketone bodies. And these ketones then serve as an alternative fuel source, especially important for the brain.
Right.
And it's worth remembering, keto isn't just one single thing. There are different versions, like standard, cyclical, targeted, even a high-protein approach.
Ah, okay. Different flavors of keto.
Sort of, but the one that's been studied the most, the one we usually talk about, is the standard ketogenic diet. That's roughly 70% fat, 20% protein, and only about 10% carbohydrates.
Wow, only 10% carbs. That's a huge shift from a typical diet.
It is a very significant shift.
Okay, let's dive into cancer first.
Yeah.
One of the central ideas I've heard involves something called the Warburg effect. What's that about?
The Warburg effect. Well, what's fascinating here is the peculiar way many cancer cells generate energy.
Peculiar how?
Unlike most of our healthy cells, which primarily use a very efficient process called oxidative phosphorylation, using oxygen.
Like the standard energy production.
Cancer cells often tend to favor a less efficient process called glycolysis. And they do this even when there's plenty of oxygen available.
Which is weird, right? Why use the less efficient way?
It is strange. Think of oxidative phosphorylation as the cell's high-efficiency power plant. It gets way more energy bang for the buck compared to glycolysis. This preference cancer cells have is the Warburg effect.
Okay. So how does the keto diet come into play?
Well, the diet dramatically reduces the availability of glucose, and glucose is the primary fuel for that glycolysis pathway cancer cells seem to love.
Ah, I see. So the idea is to starve them of their preferred fuel.
That's the fundamental concept. You try to flip the metabolic switch on these cancer cells by limiting glucose. Meanwhile, your normal, healthy cells, they can adapt pretty well and use those ketone bodies for energy instead.
Okay, that makes sense. Cutting off their main energy supply line. And I think there's also a connection to blood sugar levels and insulin, isn't there?
Precisely. That's a really important secondary effect if we look at the bigger picture. A ketogenic diet lowers blood glucose levels. That, in turn, reduces the levels of insulin and another similar messenger called insulin-like growth factor, or IGF.
And why are insulin and IGF important here?
Well, think of both insulin and IGF as key signals in the body that basically tell cells, okay, time to grow and divide.
Growth promoters.
Exactly. And many types of cancer cells can actually use these signals, insulin and IGF, to fuel their own growth and proliferation.
So by lowering blood sugar and insulin with keto,
you might indirectly help to slow down the cancer's progress by reducing those growth signals.
Okay, that makes sense in theory. So what about the actual lab studies? What does the preclinical evidence tell us?
The preclinical work has certainly generated a lot of interest, yeah. The source material you mentioned highlights quite extensive research on neuroblastoma, for instance.
Neuroblastoma, okay. What did they find?
Researchers found that a specific ketogenic diet, one with a 2-to-1 ratio of fat to carbs plus protein, when they combined it with calorie restriction, it significantly reduced tumor growth in animal models.
That sounds promising. But calorie restriction?
Yeah.
That sounds tough.
It is, and here's where it gets really interesting and kind of complicated. Calorie restriction, while it might seem beneficial in the lab, isn't always a viable option for actual cancer patients.
Why not?
Especially for those experiencing something called cachexia. That's a severe form of wasting where the body loses a lot of muscle and fat. It's very common in advanced cancer.
Right. You absolutely can't afford to weaken someone further if they're already dealing with significant weight loss like that.
Exactly. It's contraindicated. So the researchers then explored how to optimize the diet itself to get similar effects without restricting calories.
Oh, smart. And?
They discovered that an ad libitum ketogenic diet, meaning the animals could eat as much as they wanted, could work.
Oh, really?
Yes, but the composition was key. It had a very high fat-to-carb plus protein ratio, 8:1, using a specific blend of fats. 25% medium-chain triglycerides, MCTs, and 75% long-chain triglycerides.
Now that worked as well as the calorie-restricted one.
It was just as effective against neuroblastoma in their models, but without the need for calorie restriction.
Wow. That really underscores how this specific type of keto diet can be absolutely critical, doesn't it? Not just keto in general.
Precisely. The details matter. A lot.
So beyond neuroblastoma, what other cancers have shown some promise in these early-stage preclinical studies?
Well, the evidence varies quite a bit. The source material indicates the strongest evidence, meaning, more than 3 studies showing an effect, points towards a potential benefit in glioblastoma.
That's a type of brain cancer, right?
A very aggressive type, yes. Then there's also what the source calls good evidence, maybe 2 or 3 studies supporting it for prostate cancer,
Right.
including an interesting preventative study there. Also for colon, pancreatic, and lung cancer, and of course neuroblastoma, as we discussed.
And any others with maybe less evidence?
Yeah, then there's limited evidence, maybe just 1 study suggesting a possible anti-tumor effect for breast, stomach, and liver cancer.
So it sounds like a real mixed bag then. Some cancers showing much stronger initial signals in the lab than others.
Definitely. It highlights that cancer isn't just one disease, is it? The biology varies hugely.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I know the research also mentions some more concerning findings at potential pro-tumor effects in certain models.
Yeah.
That seems really crucial to understand.
It is, and this raises a really important question about whether a ketogenic diet is universally beneficial or even safe across all cancers.
What do they find?
The source highlights some critical counterexamples. For instance, in lab mice with a model of renal cell carcinoma kidney cancer, along with something called Stauffer's syndrome, the ketogenic diet actually led to significant weight loss and liver problems.
Oof, not good.
Not good at all. Another study in rats, this time with tuberous sclerosis complex and kidney cancer, actually showed a pro-tumor effect with long-term keto treatment. The diet seemed to make things worse.
Wow.
And perhaps most strikingly, in a mouse model of a very specific genetic subtype of melanoma, BRF V600E positive melanoma. Okay, a specific genetic marker.
Exactly. In that specific model, the ketogenic diet significantly increased tumor growth.
Increased it. The opposite effect.
Yes. The researchers even found that acetoacetate, which is one of the main ketone bodies produced on the diet,
Yeah.
it actually seemed to stimulate the cancer-promoting signaling pathway in this particular type of melanoma.
Wow. That's a really stark contrast to the anti-tumor effects we were just discussing. It really emphasizes the complexity here.
It absolutely does. And what's even more intriguing, maybe, is that the same ketogenic diet had absolutely no effect on other melanoma types they tested in the same study.
Like ones without that specific BRAF mutation.
Exactly, like NRIS Q61K positive melanoma or melanoma without either of those common mutations, called wild type. No effect there. Positive or negative.
So it really drills down to the specific genetic makeup of the tumor.
It seems to play a crucial role in how the tumor responds to this kind of metabolic intervention.
But wait, there was a human case mentioned too, wasn't there? Something contradictory? Ah, yes, that's a fascinating little twist. While those mouse models showed this pro-tumor effect in that specific BRAF positive melanoma, there is an anecdotal human case report mentioned in the source. It involved a patient with that same type of melanoma, the BRAF V600E positive kind, which had become resistant to the standard targeted drug treatments.
Okay.
And in that one human case, the patient seemed to actually benefit from adding a ketogenic diet.
So the opposite of the mouse study for the same cancer type? How does that work?
Well, it's just one case report, so we can't draw firm conclusions. But it suggests that even within the same cancer subtype, the response might not be uniform, maybe other factors are involved, or the context of drug resistance changes things. It's complicated.
Definitely complex. So, okay, moving from the lab and these specific cases to actual human clinical trials. What does the evidence look like right now? I know the source pointed out a lack of large randomized controlled trials.
That's correct. High-quality human data is still, relatively speaking, in the early stages.
So what do we have?
Most of what we have are things like preliminary studies, case reports, pilot trials, and reviews that try to pull these together.
Sure.
A recent review, mentioned in the source, looked at a collection of these studies. It found that about 42% of the included studies provided some evidence for an anti-tumor effect with ketogenic diets.
Okay, 42%. What about the rest?
Around 29% showed basically no effect, neither harm nor benefit. And interestingly, only one study in that review reported a potential pro-tumor effect in humans.
So it hints at potential benefit in some human cancers, maybe more often than not in the study so far.
It hints at it, yes. But the overall evidence is generally considered, let's say, weak or preliminary.
Why weak?
Well, because of the nature of these initial studies, they often involve small numbers of patients, they use varied study designs, making comparison hard, and there are real challenges in getting people to strictly stick to such a restrictive diet long term.
Right. Adherence must be a major issue.
It really is.
So for specific cancers in humans, is there any type where the evidence, even if preliminary, is a bit more substantial?
The source indicates that probably the strongest human evidence we have right now for the safe application of a ketogenic diet is in glioblastoma.
Back to the brain cancer.
Yes. There seems to be more research focused there, and it appears feasible and generally safe in that patient group based on current studies.
But still no definitive recommendations.
No, not yet. Even for glioblastoma, we're really waiting for the results of ongoing, larger, randomized controlled clinical trials to give us more conclusive answers on whether it actually improves outcomes.
Okay. So the main takeaway for cancer seems to be, well, it's complicated. There's exciting preclinical data, some encouraging early signals in human studies, particularly maybe for glioblastoma.
Right.
But whether a keto diet can actually help as an adjuvant therapy, an add-on treatment,
Yeah.
it really seems to depend heavily on the very specific type and even the genetic characteristics of that individual tumor.
Exactly. It is definitely not looking like a one-size-fits-all solution.
And we urgently need more rigorous research in humans, proper clinical trials.
Absolutely. The source really emphasizes that careful preclinical evaluation, testing it in the lab first for each specific cancer type and even subtype, is absolutely crucial before we can confidently consider using it more widely in human patients.
Makes total sense. Okay, let's shift gears now. Let's explore the ketogenic diet in the context of type 2 diabetes. This is another area where it's generating a lot of discussion.
It certainly is. A very different context, but similar levels of interest.
Can you remind us of the key aspects of the diet when we're talking about diabetes management? Is it the same standard keto?
Pretty much the same principles, yes. Type 2 diabetes, as we know, is a hugely widespread and serious chronic metabolic disorder.
Yeah, that affects millions.
And lifestyle changes, particularly what we eat, medical nutrition therapy, are really a fundamental part of managing it effectively without just relying on drugs. So in this context, the ketogenic diet again involves that very low carbohydrate intake, usually aiming for less than 50 grams per day, sometimes even lower.
Still very low.
Yes, combined with a high intake of fat and a moderate amount of protein. The main goal, just like we discussed before, is to induce ketosis, where the body shifts to using ketone bodies for energy.
And why the interest here specifically? Is it just about blood sugar?
That's a big part of it, but there's also been a lot of recent interest in its potential to help with weight management, especially in individuals with type 2 diabetes who are also overweight or obese.
The link between weight and diabetes.
Exactly. We know there's a very strong link between obesity and developing type 2 diabetes, and also with the severity of its complications. So tackling weight is key.
And our source material included a meta-analysis that looked at this specifically in people with type 2 diabetes, right?
Yes, a meta-analysis combining data from 8 randomized controlled trials that involved over 600 participants, all with type 2 diabetes.
Okay, so a decent number of studies pooled together. What were the key findings? What did they see with keto versus other diets?
They found some pretty noteworthy results. Firstly, they observed significantly stronger body weight loss in the groups following a ketogenic diet compared to those on other types of diets, like low-fat diets.
Okay, better weight loss.
And also a greater reduction in waist circumference, which is important for metabolic health. Interestingly, though, they didn't find a significant difference when they looked at BMI reductions specifically.
Okay. Weight and waist size, but not BMI necessarily. What about blood sugar control?
That was another positive finding. They noted a slightly greater decrease in HbA1c in the ketogenic diet group.
And HbA1c is that marker for long-term blood sugar control, right?
Exactly. It reflects your average blood sugar over the past 2 to 3 months. So a decrease there suggests better long-term glucose regulation.
So positive impacts on both weight and long-term blood sugar. What about other important metabolic indicators like cholesterol, triglycerides?
Yeah, they looked at those too. That's another area where the ketogenic diet showed some potentially beneficial effects.
Oh, jazz.
The meta-analysis found a significantly greater reduction in triglyceride levels in the keto groups.
Lower triglycerides, that's generally good.
Yes, and also an increase in HDL cholesterol. That's one often referred to as the good cholesterol.
Higher HDL, also good. What about the others? Total cholesterol, LDL.
Interestingly, they didn't observe any significant changes, up or down, in total cholesterol or LDL cholesterol levels, the bad cholesterol between the keto groups and the comparison diet groups.
So a bit of a mixed picture on the cholesterol front, but definite improvements in triglycerides and HDL.
That seems to be the pattern observed in this analysis, yes.
Those improvements in triglycerides and HDL are certainly encouraging for cardiovascular health, which is a big concern in diabetes. What are the possible reasons, the mechanisms behind these benefits we're seeing? Why the weight loss, for example?
The source discusses several potential mechanisms for the weight loss. It's likely multifactorial. One idea is that keto might attenuate the decrease in resting energy expenditure that usually happens when you lose weight. Basically, your metabolism might not slow down quite as much.
Helping to sustain the weight loss.
Potentially. There's also talk about appetite suppression. This could be directly via the ketone bodies themselves, or maybe through changes in hunger-regulating hormones like ghrelin or CCK.
So you feel less hungry.
That's the theory. Other possibilities include the body becoming more metabolically efficient at using fat for fuel, a reduction in lipogenesis, the body's process of making fat from carbs.
Since there are fewer carbs around.
Exactly. Plus an increase in lipolysis, the breakdown of stored fat. And finally, there's an increased metabolic cost associated with gluconeogenesis.
Gluconeo what?
Gluconeogenesis. That's the body having to create glucose from non-carbohydrate sources like protein. It takes energy to do that.
Right, so it burns a few extra calories just making the glucose it needs. Okay, that's a complex interplay of effects driving the weight loss. What about the improved blood sugar control, the lower HbA1c?
That's probably a bit more straightforward. The improved glycemic control is likely, in large part, a direct result of simply eating far fewer carbohydrates.
Makes sense. Less sugar and lower blood sugar.
Pretty much. It leads to lower overall blood glucose levels and probably less fluctuation throughout the day. The reduction in HbA1c then reflects that better long-term glucose regulation.
Is that the only reason?
Well, there's also a possibility that the mild state of ketosis itself might actually improve the body's sensitivity to insulin, particularly in peripheral tissues like muscle.
So it could help combat insulin resistance.
Potentially, yes, which, as you know, is a core problem in type 2 diabetes.
Right, the hallmark of the disease. Okay, and what about the lipid changes? The lower triglycerides and higher HDL. What's the thinking there?
The researchers who did the meta-analysis suggest this could be partly related to the kinds of people who were in these studies.
What?
They were generally overweight or obese individuals who likely already had some level of dyslipidemia, unhealthy lipid levels, like high triglycerides and low HDL at the start. So there is more room for improvement, perhaps.
Okay, baseline characteristics mattered.
Possibly. And the ketogenic diet's impact on improving insulin resistance might also play a significant role here, as insulin resistance is known to mess with lipid metabolism, often leading to high triglycerides and low HDL.
So improving insulin sensitivity could indirectly improve those lipid markers too.
That's a very plausible link, yes.
Now, it's important to remember, as with any meta-analysis, this one has limitations we should be aware of, right? We can't take it as the absolute final word.
Absolutely. The source itself and the authors of the meta-analysis point out several limitations.
Like what?
Well, for one, the relatively small number of studies that met their criteria to be included, only 8 trials. More studies would give us more confidence.
Okay, small number of studies.
Also, there was some missing data in certain studies for some outcomes which can affect the analysis. And a potentially significant point, the participants in these trials were predominantly Caucasian.
So a potential population bias.
Yeah.
We don't know if these results would hold up in, say, Asian or African populations.
Exactly. It raises questions about generalizability to more diverse populations.
Any other limitations?
Just the inherent difficulties in assessing the risk of bias in studies that involve lifestyle interventions, like diet changes. The standard tools we use for drug trials don't always fit perfectly. It's hard to truly blind participants to which diet they're on, for example.
Right. You definitely know if you're eating keto or not.
You certainly do.
Okay. So bearing those limitations in mind, what was the overall conclusion from the authors of this meta-analysis regarding keto for type 2 diabetes?
Based on the evidence they reviewed, the authors concluded that the ketogenic diet does appear to be an effective intervention, at least in the short to medium term, for helping overweight or obese individuals with type 2 diabetes to lose weight and improve their glycemic levels, specifically looking at that HbA1c marker.
And the lipids.
And also for improving certain lipid profiles, specifically lowering triglycerides and increasing HDL cholesterol.
So quite a positive conclusion overall, despite the caveats.
It leans positive for those specific outcomes in that population over the duration studied, yes.
Okay. So let's try to bring it all together then from our deep dive today. It feels like two related but distinct stories.
It does.
When it comes to cancer, the ketogenic diet shows, well, intriguing potential in the early research, particularly by targeting how cancer cells get their energy, that Warburg effect. However, its effects seem highly specific to the tumor type, maybe even its genetics. And crucially, there have been some concerning instances where it actually seemed to promote tumor growth in certain lab models.
That's a critical point, yes, the context dependency.
So the bottom line for cancer is, we really need those large, well-designed clinical trials in humans to get clearer answers before making any recommendations.
Absolutely. Much more research needed there.
Then, for type 2 diabetes, the picture seems a bit clearer, at least in the short to medium term. The ketogenic diet appears to offer real benefits for weight loss, for blood sugar management looking at HbA1c,
Right.
and for some lipid improvements, specifically triglycerides and HDL, in people who are overweight or obese.
Based on the current meta-analysis evidence, yes.
However, even there, more research is necessary, right?
Yeah.
Especially to understand the long-term effects, safety, sustainability, and to really nail down all the precise biological mechanisms at play.
Exactly. Long-term data is often lacking in diet studies, and fully understanding why it works is still ongoing work.
That's a really clear and, I think, accurate summary of where the current research stands.
Yeah, I think that covers the key nuances. And it's vital, as always, to keep in mind that both of these areas, keto for cancer, keto for diabetes, are very active fields of investigation.
Things are changing fast.
They are. Our understanding is constantly being refined as new studies emerge. So, the information we've discussed today, it reflects the current scientific findings, but it should absolutely not be taken as medical advice.
Crucial disclaimer.
Anyone considering a ketogenic diet, particularly if they have an existing health condition like cancer or type 2 diabetes, must consult with their own doctor or qualified healthcare provider.
Yeah. To discuss if it's appropriate, if it's safe for them, given their specific situation.
Couldn't agree more. Personalized advice is key.
That's absolutely crucial advice. And it really makes you think, doesn't it? When you consider these very different, sometimes contradictory responses we're seeing across various cancer types, and then the promising yet still developing picture for type 2 diabetes. What does all this tell us about just how personalized nutritional interventions might really need to be in the future?
Yeah, it points strongly in that direction.
And maybe how incredibly important it is to really dig deep and understand the fundamental biological mechanisms that are driving these effects, not just observe the outcome, but know why it's happening.
Understanding the why is critical for progress.
It feels like these findings, both the positive and the cautionary ones, could really shape where future research goes and potentially lead to much more targeted and hopefully more effective treatment or management strategies down the line.
That's the hope, isn't it? Using this knowledge to develop better, more personalized approaches.
Well, thanks so much for exploring this really fascinating and complex topic with me today. A lot to think about.